Dutchsinse here. It is 11:40 p.m. Central Time on Monday, April 14th, 2014. And we're looking at Earthquake 3D, which is a USGS feed of the most recent earthquakes. We just had another 7.0 magnitude earthquake, now downgraded by the USGS to a 6.9, but another one. And this one just occurred along the South Mid-Atlantic Ridge north of Antarctica. And we'll get the stats on this. This comes from the USGS. In the Bouvet Island regions, 7.3 miles deep, again, right along the plate fracture boundary region. Now, to see another 7.0 occur, in the last 7 days, we've seen multiple large earthquakes occur around the entire planet now, not just limited to the Ring of Fire. And increased activity occurring at Yellowstone and in Oklahoma along the edge of the craton with borderline 5.0 earthquakes, 4.2 in Oklahoma, multiple 4.0s in Yellowstone or in the Yellowstone magma chamber. Then multiple 6.0s, mid 6.0s happening in Central America at the same time. Guatemala, also Ecuador, and Chile, all three had volcanoes erupt in the last 2 weeks, some rather unexpectedly. Now to see this 7.0, now 6.9, strike the South Atlantic. That's along the South Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and we saw multiple earthquakes occur along the Mid-Atlantic this week, 5.0s at the center, and then up here at the North Pole. Directly at the North Pole, a 4.7 struck on April 12th. Now also, kind of oddly, last year, on April 12th of 2013, a 4.7 struck the exact same spot. We documented that, got that on my Facebook page. Won't get into that now other than to say it's extremely odd to see earthquakes happen at the North Pole, normally, sizable, and to have them both happen on the same day at the same magnitude 1 year apart, very strange. 4.9 just west of the Azores, and this is part of Portugal, but these are volcanic related. It's rather shallow to see that, but that's not actually mid-Atlantic, that's actually in the island chain, the volcanoes there. But further west, let me get into the United States here really quick. We'll look at all the earthquakes 2.5 and greater in the U.S. Now there's going to be some areas that stand out right off the bat, of course. We've got Oklahoma here, which has been confirmed now, fracking operations causing these earthquakes. Now, what's causing the fracking operation to move to begin with? It's actually the pressure that's coming from the West Pacific. Look at the amount of earthquakes happening over here to the west. We have multiple 7.0 and 8.0 earthquakes occurring, and not to mention hundreds of 4 and 5.0 earthquakes happening here to the west. It's spilling over across Alaska, and then we see this silent area here along British Columbia. This has been rather silent for a fairly long time. There was that 7.7 that struck, I'm going to say a year and a half ago in BC. Haven't seen any sizable movement there since. Now the pressure is coming over, spilling over from the west. And that's given away by, we can just watch the earthquake progression here. You see all this activity here at the Western Yellowstone magma chamber. That is confirmed to be the Western Yellowstone magma chamber. Put out several graphics showing everybody what we're talking about here. And the craton, for instance, this is the unsubducted plate, the North American plate. So you can see earthquakes are defining the edge of the craton, the entire edge of the plate. And I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but the entire edge of the plate has been displaced all the way as far east as Tennessee now. Come back over here, take a look. Yellowstone magma chamber, the Western Yellowstone magma chamber, multiple 4 and 3.0 earthquakes and smaller 2.0, 2.5s. And then hundreds of earthquakes occurring at the Oklahoma fracking operation. Also 3.1 occurring at the Colorado fracking operation. This lone 2.7 here is actually at the Yellowstone Park. So this movement, the whole plate being displaced, it's coming from the west and spilling over to the east in the U.S. This lets you know areas to watch. Now, the areas that are in flux, the edge of the craton, no activity up here to the northeast as well. With this amount of pressure building to the west, spilling over at the fracking operations, which, ironically, the French, I think a week and a half ago, announced they figured out a way to make a, quote, earthquake shield. And their idea is, and they've done this apparently, they actually did the experiments and went out in the field and did this, drill bore shafts, frac wells, into the ground several miles away from the area you want to protect. So, for instance, if you had pressure building from the west in Oklahoma, you would do a fracking operation here in Colorado that could take the effect, the pressure, and relieve it in those small wells. Okay? So that's what Oklahoma is doing here right now with all the pressure that's naturally coming from the Pacific Northwest. This past week also confirmed Yellowstone has risen. This is USGS GPS measurements. USGS confirms Yellowstone has risen 2 inches since New Year's. And if you were to look at the charts, you would see that the charts are flying through the roof. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's the graphic. Here's New Year's. You can see the rise. This is previous. And you go back and look at previous years, it looks like this. And then you get to 2014, and it rises even on the year chart. Okay? Now, it's also been pushed a 1/2 inch southeast. So you can measure this. This is in millimeters. Pushed a 1/2 inch southeast and raised 2 inches since New Year's. So Yellowstone being pushed this way. Is it any wonder or shock that we're starting to see earthquakes down here because the pressure is coming from up here pressing this way? Also, that explains why we're starting to see activity down near Los Angeles and Salton Sea. The Salton Sea Butte volcanoes, freshly elevated to active by the USGS just a 1.5 years ago. Salton Sea Buttes starting to show activity every time we see this swarm activity here along the edge of the craton. And again, the edge of the craton is the unsubducted portion of the North American plate, and it's being displaced from the west. That means we have to watch along this edge, in the states along this edge, for earthquake activity in the near term based upon the activity happening internationally. So South America, we had the multiple 7 and 8.0s in Chile. Over here, we have multiple 7 and 8.0 earthquakes happening. This is just the last 7 days. So we have 3 7.0 earthquakes over here in the West Pacific in the last 7 days. And then look at all the 4.0 and greater earthquakes. These are just 4.0 and greater. So there's many more smaller earthquakes happening, like in the US, for instance. You see the stack of 2 and 3s. Well, we're just looking internationally at 4.0 and greater. So we have 2 cluster spots here in the West Pacific, Southwest Pacific. We need to watch Japan going south to Taiwan. Compensation movement, which they, quote unquote, the geologists, say doesn't occur. They say one large earthquake is not related to the other. However, that's been disproved in my eyes when you see an 8.0 happen over here in the East Pacific at this cluster spot, and in the same week's time, an 8.3 strike over here, which was now downgraded to 7.7. However, still, to see that both happen in the same week is proof to me that the compensation movement and a spillover effect, a pressure transfer earthquake effect, does happen. One earthquake does lead to another somewhere else on the planet. Adjacent areas, usually. Sometimes the pressure builds, and like a teeter-totter effect on top of a balancing plate, you can imagine a spillover back and forth, a tennis match of earthquakes that occurs on a daily basis almost, back and forth or up along the plates. And the pressure that's building, the transfer that's occurring happens. You can see it spill over. We'll just look over the last 7 days again, watch these spill over from west to east. That proves that the subduction process is not capable or is not taking care of the pressure that would normally be relieved through subduction is happening from the northwest maybe shifted at an angle, maybe it's coming at a different direction. Whatever the reason, the spillover is obvious. Same thing is happening in the West Pacific. We'll look at the last 7 days and we'll back this out. You can see all the 4.0 earthquakes happening. Here you can connect the dots all the way over to Europe, where the 5.0 just happened today in South Greece. Now we are expecting movement in South Greece, and I would expect further movement here in this region, possibly in a larger earthquake event, could be as far northwest as the north part of Italy. Now this is something we need to watch just over the next couple weeks or less until this starts to die down. Hopefully this will have calmed down in the next couple weeks. But with this recent 7.0 that just happened, it just lets me know that there's further movement that we can expect, and we can expect it in the near term. Now, the South Mid-Atlantic, not a normally huge earthquake-prone area, we would need to be aware in adjacent areas. This could put an earthquake somewhere up here in the Indian Ocean. You remember the two back-to-back 8.0s, mid 8.0s, almost 9.0s that set this whole thing into motion almost 2 years ago when the Indo-Australian plate fractured. So we need to be aware, guys. Have an earthquake plan ready and be prepared. I know you've already heard it. You've heard it 1,000 times. But just have one ready. It's okay if you don't ever have to use it, and it doesn't have to be super major. But just have the basics covered. Food, water, transportation, communications. Take care of your pets and your kids. Make sure those plans are known in the back of your head, and you possibly have a few supplies put to the side in case something happens. Okay? Much love, guys. I hope this helps. And again, watch the silent areas. We need to watch the northeast part of the North American craton, the pressure that's building along the edge. It's terminating here in Tennessee. We need to watch Quebec and along the East Coast for possible movement. Also British Columbia. One other area that I didn't mention that we probably should really mention would be Mexico. With the amount of activity happening here, you have multiple volcanoes erupting, multiple 6.0s happening to your south. There's not been any activity in Mexico itself in a fairly long while. You remember the multiple 7 and 8.0 earthquakes that happened over the last 2 years in Mexico, and Mexico has been silent the last several months. Another area that's been rather silent, Colombia. Colombia, South America, right? You don't normally think of Colombia as being a large earthquake epicenter area. However, there were 3 7.0 earthquakes, 2011 and 2012, that struck in Colombia. Again, when this kind of movement was happening in the West Pacific, we saw this movement in the East Pacific. This time it looks like it's hitting Chile. The silence to the north, we need to be aware. That may be why Nicaragua put themselves onto high alert. Just because they know there's got to be some kind of compensation that happens here when this amount of activity is happening elsewhere in adjacent areas. Cheers.